Well, good evening, everybody. I'm so glad all of you have shown up here in our beautiful historic sanctuary, and welcome to all of those who are joining us online as well for this evening. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Adult Education here at Central Synagogue. And we are gathered here tonight beneath this new transformative work of art that has really changed the nature of our sanctuary. It has been an honor to be a part of this process, this experience. Installation is a new direction for our arts programming here. As many of you well know, music is, pardon the pun, central to our identity here at Central Synagogue. And we've also brought other performing arts into this space, including the dance of Liz Lerman and Jonah Beaucaire in the last couple of years. This really feels like an extension of that kind of arts programming, this brand new installation here in our sanctuary. It is a pleasure to have Nell Breyer, a congregant, a longtime Central member and part of the extended Central family, to be the one to bring this beautiful installation to us. Where Lines Converge, the title of this work, it will be up until next summer here in this space. And if you aren't physically here with us tonight, anybody joining us online should know that you can visit this piece on Fridays when we have Shabbat services open to the public. And you are also very welcome to join us on Wednesdays at midday, starting on the 23rd of November, as a drop-in, reflective, meditative time that you can visit us. So, Where Lines Converge is part of, and also separate from, our year of Get Inspired, Get Connected, and Get Shabbat programming and prayer together. So we're here to learn from Nell what this piece means. What does it say to you? Where does it come from? So let us hear from the artist, from Nell Breyer. Nell, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you, and thank you to the incredible Central Synagogue team, and thank you to all of you who came out and anyone on Zoom. It's really nice to have bodies in the space, and I'm very curious to hear from you what you feel the work means. And I hope this is an open conversation, and I think there will be some times for question and for exploring around the piece. So I'm a choreographer, and I view this installation as a gesture. I hope that it invites you to move through the space, to think about this more like a verb than a noun, and pretty much, I hope, as a lot of my work is interested in how we perceive movement and conceive of movement, invite you to think about your body in the space and how individually and collectively we are in between, between we receive the movement and we pass on the movement. We are constantly reimagining what our movement actually is and how that has a ripple effect around us. So I had the very daunting task of trying to figure out what on earth to add to this remarkable space, and I think Sarah will tell us a little bit about the Moorish architecture and the origins of that and its relationship to different strains of Judaism. But as you can see, it doesn't need much. So part of the idea was to use something extremely simple. So it's just string and brass plumb bobs, the kind of most simple tools, and as it turns out, some of the most ancient tools, hearkening back to Babylonian times, that we have to measure a straight vertical line in the space. So I decided to focus on that act of measuring and offer a kind of attempt, maybe a fallible human attempt at expressing and drawing out what the height of this building and beyond makes us feel. How you can imagine and also change your perceptions of where the activity in the space is.
And that's one of the most complicated questions of this piece. How do you change where activity is? Most of us who have been in this sanctuary before think of the activity, of the action happening in really, I mean, I'll be generous with height, but 7 feet above the ground and below. I don't know if we have many 7-foot congregants, but just opening the possibility that we do. Most of what we do is centered down towards human height and human scale, but the sanctuary itself is so much more than that, and intentionally so. And so you've really opened up the space.
And I think that, as you mentioned, music is such a big part. So part of the line of inquiry, yes, a gesture, but also thinking about how much music and the vibrations and the sound and the light and the air are actually a very central part of the experience here. And all that happens on the ground plane is amplified and made possible through what is happening above us. So that there is definitely an intended focus on making us reconsider the variations in the light and the color and the temperature and the sound and basically how everything moves. So
Nell, take us back to the beginning. You became a practicing artist certainly by the time you were in college at Yale and studying painting. Can you bring us through what you studied, how you began to see the world, and how that brings you into movement-based art and physical movement-based choreography? Your two gigs.
Right, exactly. I have a somewhat of a meandering path. It seems very directed to me, but perhaps I'm the only one. I did study painting at Yale. And then I felt I would be a much better painter if I understood really how the brain worked. And not just a better painter, but really understood the mechanisms of perceiving movement. I've always painted movement. I've always been interested from a dance and a imagistic standpoint. And I read an article by Seymour Zecke back in 1992 in Scientific American saying that the visual cortex is organized by nerve populations that include color, dynamic form, and line. And I said, surprise, artists have known this for a long time, right? They use a color palette, they use drawing, and they use gesture or a stroke. I don't know why, scientists are so far behind artists, but needless to say, maybe I'll learn something more by going and studying neuroscience. So I did that for a while, very hard, quickly learning I was not a scientist, no offense to the scientists in the audience. And then moved back. I had the privilege of running a wonderful artist by the name of Sarah Z's studio, and I have had the great privilege of working with her on several of her pieces. And then had an opportunity to basically become an artist and I don't know what else at MIT for about a decade. So I had a chance to continue to work with scientists and engineers who think a lot about perception and develop tools and technologies to understand and make that accessible. And then also had a chance to develop my own work and collaborate with other artists and choreographers and dancers.
So you've used some terms that I think really come together in both your artistic and choreographic practice, but also really we can see coming out in Where Lines Converge in this installation right here. So you've used the words vision and space and perception and gesture. So vision, how we see space, the space that we are in, perception, so how we understand that space, and gesture, how we move through a space. This work doesn't stand alone. All of these ideas come together in your work and have come from places. Do you want to start with talking about some of the folks and the works that have influenced you, or do you want to talk about your work and how this exists within your body of work? Which is more interesting to you right now?
I certainly we can do both. I have some slides. I don't know if we can maybe look at those. I certainly am aware of the wonderful and important works from pre-1960 onwards, but look a lot at the Judson Church Fluxus cohort from Tricia Brown's experimentation with gravity in the 60s and onwards, to where Elizabeth Streb took that over and has produced wonderful public art and dance, as well as very famous minimalists and conceptualists like Fred Sandback. I hope he wouldn't be offended by this piece, and Solowit and many, many others. I think there are a lot of living artists, too, that think about proprioception and how the body understands movement not just by seeing. In fact, using sensory modalities and lots of different kinds of input are as much a way we understand what movement is as our vision. So you look at Torque de Lips by Richard Serra, and it's all about that.
So Torque de Lips, which I know we don't have a slide of, is an experience that, well, it's a sculpture, but that's a sculpture that an artist made. For us, it becomes an experience, a physical experience of a piece of steel that turns and twists, so you can never see past the end of it as you walk through and past it. It changes our vision, it changes our perception, but it requires our movement in order to activate the work. But Solowit is somebody that you mentioned, and his work is just over your shoulder here.
So this was these are some of my drawings, but you can, if you go to the next slide, you can see this is a piece that I did back in 2010. It was actually a performance and a dual channel video installation. It was done, I was given permission by the Solowit estate to do the piece. His work is the spectacular, I would just go a little slowly here while I'm talking, the spectacular polychrome floor. It's pulverized glass and pigment that is embedded under the floor. They are these remarkable isometric squares, vast tiles that are three sides of a courtyard atrium.
At MIT.
Yeah, at MIT. If you go a slide more forward, I think you can start to see this is a 6-story experience with a glass ceiling. The physics building, the inner core of the building is at its center, and it's surrounded on 3 sides, actually, by all the kinds of engineering departments. This space, as remarkable and kind of sanctuary-like as it is totally only discoverable by mistake. And if anyone knows the MIT campus, it's incredibly utilitarian and nowhere near this stunning. So it's already was like fascinating to me that in an engineer's environment, you would have such a remarkable kind of discovery of light and air and space. So the piece, if you move forward one slide, was an opportunity to invite people to meditate on the space. And so over the course of roughly an hour, audience members could travel anywhere from the 6th story all the way down to the floor. The piece unfolds quite slowly. We'll give you about a 2-minute version of what people had to experience, but responds to the collapsed 3 dimensions in 2 dimensions, and obviously the way that we can never take in full that 360-degree experience of the space that we live in the world. And so your movement allows you to capture fragments and reassemble them. And I'm obviously very interested in how that is informed by our physical movement as well as all these other sensory modalities. So if you move forward, I was as much, we'll play a little bit of the video, so you get a sense of, there's a lot of different developments. This piece was also specifically citing a famous collaboration by Solowit and Lucinda Childs and Philip Glass called Dance, which was a wonderful reframing of gravity, which this talks a lot about. How do you shift gravity 90 degrees, and then what weird brain exercises do we do to realign or straighten or change our own relationship to gravity as we're watching this. Obviously, the dancers are lying flat on the floor, and
that may not actually be obvious.
Oh, really?
Because our perspective has shifted so much here that experience of vision, we're not physically in the space. Yeah. So it's harder to, our brains want them as dancers to be standing up. We want what they're against to be a wall, but what they're against is a floor. And so you've talked about this piece, focusing on shifting perspective, a physical experience of the world by 90 degrees, right?
Yes. So obviously, the viewers had to look down. They start the performance from a bird's eye view and end the performance from a worm's eye view, and are expected to collate that and respond to that. The dancers follow a progression of movements, both individually. So there's 12 of those squares, and as I mentioned, you can't ever see what's happening in all of them at the same time. You're choosing what not to view as well as what to view. And the collective movements which happen in different parts of this piece also change. Like, they move too fast for you to take it all in, and you have to respond in different ways. But to me, it's very interesting when things move too slowly to see as well as too quickly to see. Both ask you to use your imagination to fill in the gaps and to pay attention to the assumptions that we make to make a picture whole, right? Or to really understand and reassemble what our experience is. Someone has a question.
We're going to actually hold questions for the end, but don't forget your question. We're going to, pardon? We will have time at the end for questions, I promise. And the slides will still be available to us. We can pull it back up. Thank you.
Okay, we can go to the next one. It keeps going. Like that, where you get the idea. This was actually, so we fast forward a decade, and this is sort of more related to this work in this space, where I started playing with the idea of a choreography with strings and stones, but thinking a lot about the movements that happen around us and through us, and informing our movement as well. Here, looking at a kind of ridiculous impulse to grid the sky. So if you go to the next slide, I had a chance to do this wonderful residency in Crete. And of course, not everything looks like Crete, but there is this astounding geologic scale of time, and the mountains that are moving, and the clouds, and the wind. So if you go to the next slide.
I will say that the color in that last image with the dark sky and the kind of golden wall, it does remind me of our sanctuary.
Yeah, yes, a little bit. So if you play this, you'll get a sense. So, of course, in the Western canon of art history, the establishing a system of perspective is extremely important for pictorial imagery since the Renaissance, and even, probably pre-Giotto, and looking at a vanishing point and establishing a vanishing point in our picture plane has played a very important role in how we see architectural space and experience that in a 2D surface. If you move forward a little bit in the slides, you can see I was playing with that, and also you can play the pathetic gridding of the sky on the left. Playing with that notion, and also the idea of these time scales that are so much bigger and so much slower, yet still capture our attention, and our bodies still respond to those kinds of changes, and our attention can slow down enough to be able to take them in. So I was hoping to have enough of a reason for people to come and stay in the space. And if you go to the next slide, we had a small exhibition of the artworks, and this is what people tended to do, which in my view, I know it's not really allowed here, but is a great success.
Oh, it's allowed. People are welcome to lie down if they want to.
Okay, you got the idea. So in the next, I'll just show you the next slide. I have one of the artists that did the residency with me in Italy. We had a wonderful opportunity to do a month-long research, individual artists from all over the world, supported by the Bogliasco Foundation. It's an incredible opportunity for any artists out there. And I did a small intervention among the other research I was doing that continued to play with this idea of vanishing points and responding to the elements. If you keep going to the next slide, which there are, a stunning seascape, remarkable sky and light and sunlight, but also these stones, which if you keep going to the next slide, all seem to have, to the next one, a really geologic time marked on their face. So if you go one last slide over, oh no, you can see the idea of this. But these markings,
that's the one.
These markings are everywhere in that, I'm not sure why, but that kind of calcification that looks like God went in and scribbled on the stones was something that I was very interested in. That of course it looks like a perfect, all on purpose, I don't know what, orchestration of time. So maybe we can just move to the slides here and invite people
Sure.
to explore the space a little bit.
Absolutely. So as the slide stays up on the screen, and for those who are joining us virtually, you'll get to continue looking at these slides. If we can cycle through them very slowly, we're going to give the folks in this space a couple of minutes just to walk around the space and think about vision and perception and gesture. Think about how your body activates this work, how it becomes a part of this work. Think about how this work, how lines converge, where lines converge, how it affects your experience of this space, and maybe how it speaks to you. So we'll just take a couple of minutes and invite people to walk around.
Can they go up to the second floor or not?
I mean, if you are a very quick person, yeah, absolutely, you are very welcome to go up to the side aisle. Not the, sadly, not the organ loft, but to the side aisle as well. So we'll take just a couple of minutes in, it may be uncomfortable feeling, but in silence, just to experience this work.
I recommend, without blinding yourself, to go under at least one of the oculi, just to see how the lines converge or burst.
Please take about another minute just to look. So we'll regather and start hearing more from Nell about this piece. And so before we open for a Q&A, which we'll do in about 15, 20 minutes, is there anything that anybody wanted to share, a sentence or so, about the experience of walking through this piece? Is there anybody who wants to share what you were thinking about, maybe how you changed your experience, thinking, feeling, any changes?
Hi, just that looking straight up from underneath one of the circles.
A little bit closer. So we just want the folks at home to be able to hear you.
Looking straight up from the middle of one of the circles, what I saw for the first time now is that the strings don't end at the circle of lights. It forms a pyramid that has a peak somewhere way above us, maybe 2 or 3 times the height of this. And that to me is very, very impressive and meaningful somehow in terms of a religious space.
Amazing. Thanks, Bob.
The placement of the lights and of the strings reminds me of the progression of the Sabbath bride down the aisle on Shabbat.
I love that. The progression of the Sabbath bride, Lecha Dodi, the progression that she comes in and joins us. That's beautiful.
The 2 words that came to mind were ethereal, but grounded, especially with the plumb bob. But when you look up, it's ethereal.
So ethereal but grounded. And I think that those would be satisfying words for the artist based on our conversations leading into it. And we will talk about that more. Is there one more comment?
I feel that as you experience it here at human height, or it's actually not because it's quite above me, I feel like it's a conversion of many as it goes way up to one, similar to the way it feels in the sanctuary, as the perception of the infinity line of we have a big space here, and as we look up it feels smaller even though we know it's not.
And you're responding to a change in perception, where many become one,
Yes.
or when large becomes small. Nell, how do you react to reactions?
No, that's such a nice. So usually my work comes from like 50 million questions that are never really answered by the end result. But definitely one of the struggles I have with thinking about movement is, and I don't know where that will go, but how you have a dichotomous experience. The individual, like when you focus on water that's moving, right? You can follow, your eye can literally follow a rivulet, or you can focus your eyes and let the stream flow over a single spot, and it's a very different experience. And I feel likewise in parallel with human movement, if you focus on the kind of energy and life force that any individual reflects, and the spontaneity and power, usually very specific and only them in that moment in that way, and compare that, if you zoom out, to the kind of, in my view, possibly like rote, even worse than that, like dangerous or terrifyingly catastrophic collective behaviors we can have en masse, or the very tragic behaviors we can have en masse, if you think about the flight of refugees at the scale of 65 million people across the globe, or warfare and the kind of conduct, and if you think about that only in choreographic terms, it can be so not just dumb, but like the most distilled and predictable forms of human behavior. It's very difficult to reconcile those two things. The individual with so much power and potential, and the collective when it can become such a destructive force or catastrophic force. So I've been thinking a lot about that, unsuccessfully, but it's a very interesting question.
One of the other questions that you shared with me in the process of conceptualizing this piece, what was going to be our experience of the world, this analog world, emerging from a digital existence. So the pandemic forced us apart, but we found ways to come back together digitally. What happens when we come back into a world where our body exists and not just our pixels? So how did that question guide this work? Or what sub-questions did you have beyond that?
I think having worked a long time, like 20 years with a lot of technology and making my own technology or asking engineers who are much better than me to make my own technology, I definitely have over the last few years had a very basic craving to go back to analog. And not just only in the process of making, to feel what a mark feels like and to have the energy be a one-to-one transfer, but also to, I guess, I don't know, choose like the simplest material, string, stones, charcoal, paper, to see if in a much more direct way our energy and an idea can go from one, from my mind into space and then have a direct response. I think the mediation that happens for me in the digital world just was no longer satisfying. And there's something very powerful about having a direct physical experience, especially if you're talking about the direct physical experience of your body moving through space.
Yeah. The stones that you used in your piece in Italy, looking at them, it really made me think that they were bearing the marks of their history in a way that our bodies do as well. And when you first suggested this piece, each of the strings was anchored by a stone that carried those kinds of marks of time and of place and of change. But you ended up with a very different material with the plumb bob, with the brass. So let's move a little bit from your conception of this piece and into the materials of this piece. You do think so clearly about material and not just conceptual ideas. So how did we come from stones to brass plumb bobs?
Mainly the stones didn't work when they weren't doing something. So I think the reason they have worked in these other experiments were that they were really anchoring actively. And I wanted to retain this idea of an action in the space because I'm not a sculptor and I'm not trying to present an object that has value. I'm trying to bring you into an experience that feels active. And I think one of the things I really found surprising in the work is that there's a dual, the strings seem to fly up as well as fall down or become anchored down. And you know that they're working with gravity. You know there's a force coming down. But when you look up, because of the light and the scale and the height, you also feel like, well, they might just be shooting up.
Pulled up.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a time it takes for you, depending on where you are in the space, to process. You can't see both. Well, you can, but it's hard. You move to see it all. And I also tried to think about that in the sort of circular. They form a circle because it's responding to the oculus. But the way the brass, these perhaps somewhat wonky, but circles that are falling apart and coming together ended up being made was a manual measurement, a wingspan of my awesome assistant, who basically manually measured a height and was incapable of repeating it, even though to him, he was trying to do the same action again and again. It wasn't. And that kind of irregularity that happens from the human touch is something I'm very interested in staying close to.
Well, irregularity from the human touch is something that the ancient Babylonians were trying to work against when they invented the plumb bob. You were really taken with this ancient engineering tool, right?
Yes, and I think we talked about this, like there aren't that many instruments created over 4,000 years ago that still serve their original purpose in the world. And I learned from you that the potter's wheel is even older than the plumb bob 4,000 years ago. And there probably aren't that many tools we've created that have retained that kind of original intent. This is a pretty great accomplishment, whoever made the plumb bob.
Well, and the plumb bob was intended to create straight lines, to create a pure vertical. And part of the beauty here is that, yes, there's a pure vertical, but as our vibrations, as our voices, as our movement shift the air, shift the particles in space here, each of these lines shifts a little bit, that they are, in some ways, like your prior projects, the string in some ways is standing in for a human body, which isn't static in space, despite whatever tools we add, whatever perfecting we try to do.
And I was wondering if you might share a little bit about what you told me, like the origins of this architecture and how we're sitting in a Moorish feeling sanctuary, which is so remarkable before you add anything to it. Right. I'd love to have you say a little bit.
Sure. And I'm, of course, intimidated because our whole docent corps is here tonight. I'm going to try to not get this wrong. Our building, the cornerstone was laid in 1870, and the doors opened in 1872. This is the height in the 19th century. This is the height of Jewish communities, and in particular Ashkenazi communities, embracing a style known as Neo-Moorish. The Neo-Moorish style was hearkening back to a past, historically a past in southern Spain, in Moorish southern Spain, the location of convivencia, of that interplay between Jews and Muslims and Christians under Muslim rule. That in that time and in that place, the influences went back and forth largely between the Muslim community and into the Jewish community, or in northern Spain, between the Christian community and into the Jewish community, creating this hybridized style in the communal buildings and in the synagogues of the Jews of Spain. 300, 400 years later, after southern Spain falls, after the Reconquista, after the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in favor of the Catholic Church, even 300, 400 years later, there's this idea that that time period represents a high point in Jewish history, and by virtue of living in and around the Mediterranean, those Jews had a legitimate and authentic tie to ancient Judaism, the last time we were one people in one place under our own autonomy. So Neo-Moorish style arises as a synagogue style of architecture in Europe, and then coming to America to recapture this past of autonomy and this past of flowering of culture and of religion. But it is, interestingly, as you pointed out, Nell, it is a tradition that is alive and well in Ashkenazi communities, as opposed to in the Sephardic communities that really gave rise to this style in the first place. So our building, which is in some ways reflecting upon the Doheny Street Synagogue, one of the great Neo-Moorish designs in Europe, that's in Hungary, that our sanctuary is also part of that story of trying to recapture this past, this fantasy of a past where Jews were creative and flowering and comfortable and safe in the place where they were.
That's beautiful. I was also thinking about one of my favorite artists, William Kentridge, who talks about a prehistory of physics. I'm sure he has it right, and I'm not sure that I will get this right, where if you imagined, people used to think that if you imagined moments in time on Earth, there was always somewhere out in space, somewhere that would receive, like a point of light, that moment in time. And of course, we are experiencing that in reverse with the James Webb Telescope and the kinds of images that are coming back to us from that unbelievable human invention, where we're seeing backwards in time things billions of years ago. But I love the image of, that you could see, I don't know, the moment of, Moses on the...
Moses is a great choice.
Yeah, if you were in the right point in space, there would be like a projector, and you'd have that moment in time.
You
in
could see
reverse.
it.
Yeah.
You quoted another artist to me as well, Anselm Kiefer, both of our favorite painter, a living German artist born in 1945. And the quote is, or paraphrasing the quote, that art is a combination of will, intellect, and feeling. Is this for the artist? Is this for the viewer? Is it for all of us? Where is the will and the intellect and the feeling for you, and especially in this piece?
I definitely interpreted that as the impetus to make work. And so what defines an artwork? And it doesn't necessarily need a material. It doesn't necessarily need an audience. And that's why I loved that combination, that triumvirate, the idea that you persist, that you have a driving inquiry, that there's thought and there's feeling. And those three components are what constitute an effective work. That's my interpretation. I don't know if that's what he meant, but if you haven't seen the show at Gagosian on 24th, you will have your jaw drop if you can go see it now. It's incredible.
Well, of that triumvirate, it almost feels, and especially in looking at this piece, that feeling might be the most important part of that. You can have will and intellect without a human being a part of it. But feeling is such a human experience that as soon as we add ourselves to the equation, as soon as we put ourselves into this installation, whether we're looking at it online or whether we're here in the sanctuary, a feeling comes naturally, and it will be different for each one of us, and it may be different each time we walk into this space. But that feeling is really what activates this as a work, as something different from what you might find in a gallery versus something you find in a synagogue. So before I open up the floor to questions, I do want to ask you one last question, which is about this sighting. What does this work mean to you that it is in a synagogue, so a synagogue, but not just any synagogue, this is your Jewish community, you are a member here. So what does this work mean to you in this context?
I feel so honored to be able to respond and reflect on the shared space, and I hope bring some new perspectives and wonder. I am constantly moved, both kind of spiritually and physically here, and I mean, it's been a great joy to have the chance to think about the ways in which we inhabit and experience and get transformed by the space. So I think I just feel very honored. And I've learned a lot. So I hope it'll mean that I make more interesting work for the next series of pieces.
Well, this one already on its own exists in a really interesting place. And so I do want to open up the floor to questions about Nell's past, about her experience, about her influences, and about this work. I know there was a question over here about the Solowit piece. If you raise your hand higher, the microphone will find its way to you.
So I created a piece for the floor. It was already there. What's interesting about that work, it was his last commission. He actually died before he saw it installed. It was installed in 2007, and I made this performance in 2010 and was reperformed in 2011. It was also a dual-channel video installation that was installed in a gallery in Boston and has been shown subsequently. And the configuration of the architecture, I did not have any responsibility for. It is very astounding and is there, and you can see it, as can members of the public. What I did was construct the way in which the audience was able to see the piece over time.
Right, but the pieces themselves are permanent in that floor space. Okay, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to clarify. It's really very interesting, and I like the dance integration movement. It's quite astounding. Congratulations on that. And just another question just about this installation, because we were talking about the fact that plumb bobs have been around for, I don't know, 1 million years. And what's interesting is that you chose them here in brass, where very traditionally in construction, I'm sure we've all seen them, they're generally lead. And was the choice for brass to complement the sanctuary space, or was it just some other design element, or kind of what moved you to that direction? Because I find it so integral in the space, it's almost as if it would change the experience, but if all of them were raised up a little bit, they could just be permanent here, because it just fills the space. And it's complements and integral, and at the same time, visually pleasing.
Great question. Thank you.
So there definitely are a lot of different materials that plumb bobs are made of. I looked at copper ones, I looked at steel ones, I looked at lead ones, I looked at brass ones. I did a lot of experimentation. As you heard, all of this started out as stones, which got tossed out the window. That did not work. I also changed these plumb bobs, believe it or not. They had like a black leather point on the ends of them, and I removed them, and I've actually whatever, you don't need to know all the details, but I thought a lot about this space in particular, and this is not a Jeff Koons puppy in the middle of the aisle. It wasn't intended to draw attention to itself, but it was intended to create the sense of, the way bees swarm, or the way starlings, do that amazing murmuring. Like you can see movement in invisible ways and feel that. So a little bit it was trying to do that. So absolutely what you're saying. I was aware of the echoing, and that it should have a combination of echoing, but not trying to be this level of ornament that is so astounding around us.
It complements the space. I think you're exactly right. Any other great question over here?
Hi. First, I wasn't here when you asked for comments. To me, this structure is very inspiring, kind of like looking up to heaven, to God. My question is this. I noticed that there are 10 of each. What does the number 10 mean to you?
So they are actually running through the 10-pointed star, which you may or may not be able to see, is the iron frame that holds that's the center of each of these oculi. So we literally tried to respond to the existing architecture and use that 10-pointed star as the framework for the circular cascade of strings that fall down.
So, and I will add to that, because one of the great traditions in Judaism is having the text, having the original information, and then making up your own interpretations as we go. So there are 7 oculi in this ceiling, 7 being one of the symbols of completeness, one of the numbers of completeness. There are 7 days in the week. in Jewishness, in Judaism. And each star is a 10-pointed star. 10 is another symbol of completeness, referring to the 10 Commandments. So if you take those 7 and you take those 10, that means there are 70 lines, 70 plumb bobs, and 70 is traditionally the number associated with all of the different versions of Torah. 70 not being a specific number, but 70 standing in for infinity. There are 70 faces of Torah because there are infinite numbers of Torah. So there are 70 of the lines. That is one of my interpretations, but here's another one that I love and can't wait to share with you from Amy Goldberger, one of our chairs of our docents. If you add 7 to 10, you have 17. But if you add yourself, you get the number of life, you get 18. So putting ourselves into the experience, into the equation, we get another one of our magic numbers. How's that for a drosh? There's a 7th one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep. So the 7th is actually hidden. There are 3 stained glass windows right above the ark. So there aren't, so I guess there are 60. There are 60 lines coming down, but the potential for 70. Yeah. All right, so we have another question towards the back.
So I asked Nell before, I said I had never heard of anyone calling themselves both an artist and a choreographer, and it fascinates me. I just wondered how you think like that. Do you say, oh, I'm going to choreograph this, or I'm going to create this, and how does that pertain to this fabulous work for us?
I would say I'm still trying to answer that question. That has been a long and unresolved tension within me. I love making work with the body, but in about 2000, I also realized I hate putting the viewer in the position of passivity, because the thing I really love is moving myself. And why don't I give that experience to everybody else? Why should you all suffer in the chair while, the dancers are having all the fun? And then I also really felt dissatisfied with the formality and the kind of pretentiousness of a proscenium stage and removing the work from life. And I find all kinds of movement absolutely remarkable and unsolvable and stunning, and it doesn't need to be a trained dancer. It can be any of us moving in any time, in any way, and also horrifying and terrifying at all. So I tried to leave the stage and think about where in public spaces does movement matter, and how does our movement reflect and change and get informed by all our surroundings. So I think my answer is that I take a choreographic mindset. I think about phrasing, I think about rhythm, I think about scores, I think about all kinds of things that a choreographer thinks about, but it may not produce a dance. I may produce something that's closer to a gesture or an intervention or an installation or something else, but it's always about movement, and it's always trying to get the viewer to become part of the solving the questions of how am I perceiving and how am I constructing this understanding of my own movement in space. I think the universe is matter and movement. So I just focused it on the second half of the universe, not the first part.
So this wonderful site-specific artwork, Where Lines Converge, it's here in our sanctuary until June. So I hope that everybody who's here will bring back several loved ones, friends, family members that they think would find meaning in this work, find a new and unusual experience by being here and becoming part of the work, by activating it with their body. Those watching virtually, I hope you'll be able to join us sometime before June to see this stunning work in person. We just have Nell and her extraordinary brain to thank for this piece. It is so special, and it really does change our space for the better. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all of you for coming.